Resident Evil 4.
One cannot discuss Resident Evil 4 without mentioning all of its ports, especially considering that most of the video will feature footage from the Wii version with classic controls enabled, as for me, that's the definitive way to play Capcom's former GameCube exclusive. This review is specifically aimed at every version directly derived from the original 2005 release. As such, we're not going to tackle the remake, as well as the mobile and VR adaptations, since despite being based on the same core, for all intents and purposes they're different games that one way or another drastically change how you play. Though even without taking those versions into account, that still leaves us with GameCube, PS2, Wii, 2 PC ports, PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. And the title is not entirely the same on each platform. And that is if we don't go into the rabbit hole of the original versions having some differences between American, European, and Japanese releases. Obviously, Resident Evil 4 was specifically tailored for GameCube, not just in terms of its controls, but also visuals as well, really tapping into the hardware's strengths. So one can never go wrong with the original release. With the popularity of the PS2, people tend to forget that GameCube was the more powerful console between the two. So the eventually released PlayStation 2 port trimmed down, well, everything. Model fidelity, amount of effects, sound quality, cutscenes became FMVs captured from the GameCube version, the lighting system was a little simplified, and there were some concessions in the AI department too. That being said, I don't want to claim that the PS2 version looks bad. In fact, it actually looks pretty great, particularly on a CRT, because even though the game had to make all these concessions, it also added a lot of filters, more fake lighting points and stuff like that to keep the overall atmosphere of the original version intact. Plus, to sort of sweeten the deal I guess, it has extra content, new unlockable costumes, weapons, and a mini-campaign called Separate Ways. Now, if you think it would be cool to have this whole content package but with GameCube graphics, then you're in luck, because that's precisely what the Wii version is. Obviously, its main selling point is the addition of motion controls, of which I'm personally not that great of a fan. It is absolutely true that always having a pointer on screen makes it very comfortable to aim your shots, a fact that I do admit I heavily abused in the shooting gallery minigame. But you still have to move the character's head around with a stick. In aiming mode, you can't use the Wiimote to push your view in a particular direction. So what was previously combined into a single input, aiming and moving the camera, is now on two inputs, though one of them is just moving the hand. I assume for some this might not be an issue, but my brain would just regularly derp out. I found that when having to constantly move around, motion controls were most comfortable for me when I'd keep the reticle as close to the center as possible, use most of the stick to aim, and then motion slightly to adjust. Which is sort of like traditional controls anyway, and luckily you can use the classic controller on the Wii to play that way. The only downside is that there are some prompts in the game, like when zooming in with a rifle, that aren't properly updated for the new control method, so if you haven't played any other version, you have to spend a little time figuring out what the actual prompts in these specific cases are. But other than that, between the three versions discussed so far, this makes it the better experience, having all the content ever made for Resident Evil 4 while retaining the best visuals from GameCube. And this is where things start getting really messy. Now, it's already enough that any HD port of an SD game has to deal with the fact that not everything looks right when the resolutions and textures are upscaled. But the modern releases of Resident Evil 4 sort of mess everything up in terms of visuals and controls even. I'm not even talking about the failed first attempt at a PC port, which I'm just going to ignore. The currently easily accessible ways to play Resident Evil 4 on modern platforms are not a great way to experience the game. First and foremost, applying 60 FPS broke a lot of actual gameplay logic that wasn't ever fixed. For example, the AI is absolutely messed up. Take a look at this footage from the PS4 version. Even the PS2 port that has simplified some of its AI behaviors doesn't have issues like these. Everything works perfectly. But on modern consoles, the AI regularly breaks. Then there are input-related issues like timing for QTEs often being much more punishing than the original title since it wasn't updated for the faster FPS. And every now and then your main character Leon gets much more shaky than he should, making it very difficult to aim properly. And speaking of aiming, the modern releases mess up the control ergonomics. The original GameCube controls are designed in such a way so that your fingers would rest pretty much always exactly on the same place, making sure that every action is at your disposal as quickly as possible. The PS2 version does a couple of weird rearrangements, like putting the very important inventory on start rather than a face button, but it's close enough that the same principles are followed. Modern releases, though, have introduced a new default control method, which is what most people will use, a quote-unquote modernized scheme, because God forbid the game asks players to aim with the left stick as per original design. I'm all for increasing accessibility, but this is making it worse. Now, suddenly, when you aim, instead of using the left stick, you have to use the right, moving your thumb off the face buttons, while the left stick becomes absolutely useless since you can't move while aiming. And then the contextual action and shoot buttons were separated into two, so now instead of your brain knowing that any action is always one button, you have to think of shooting and attacking with a knife as separate from performing actions in the world. And then, instead of left trigger being knife aiming and right ranged weapon aiming, which makes it very easy for your brain to quickly figure out what button to press, both are on the left side, only one is a bumper and another a trigger. It's really not comfortable, and if you ever felt Resident Evil 4 had clunky and outdated controls while playing it on a modern system, that's most likely why. At least on PS4, I'm not sure about other platforms, there is a Type 3 control setting that attempts to recreate the classic control scheme. But for some reason, it does even more changes in comparison to the PS2 layout, so it's still not that comfortable. Adding insult to injury, the sound mixing is absolutely off in these releases. There is a bunch of UI bugs where some elements might literally not appear on the screen, and the new textures are very inconsistent in their quality, creating a very weird look. The remasters also lack tons of visual effects from the original, so everything looks flat in comparison. Dynamic lights? All gone. As a result, shooting effects look bad, fire looks bad, boom, gone, specular highlights, gone, depth of field, gone. A lot of point lights that were placed with the intention of creating contrast and making various objects more visible are also missing. This severely affects the atmosphere. However, if you have access to the Resident Evil 4 Ultimate HD Edition on PC, even though it has the same issues as other modern releases, I could still recommend using that version thanks to the work of fans. First, there is a tool called RE4Tweaks. Not only it reintroduces some, though not all, of the missing effects and makes the game work properly at high frame rates, it also adapts controls to make more sense with keyboard and mouse, retaining the spirit of proper ergonomics. Though it should be noted that, like with the Wii pointer, the game's difficulty is not designed for such a precise tool as a mouse, so it might feel easier than in the original. Then, on PC, you have access to HD Project, one of the best fan-made graphical modifications in existence. The amount of work put into it is literally insane. Tons of new models, new textures inspired by the same reference places the developers used. Lots of visual effects were brought back, though since stuff like dynamic lighting had to be re-implemented on a case-by-case basis, not everything has it, just so you would understand the extent of how much the remasters are messed up in terms of visuals and what the fans were working on to fix and improve. That being said, I still prefer the Wii version. Look, the Resident Evil 4 HD project is amazing. It actually makes the game look really good in HD resolutions. I have nothing but respect for the people who have spent years of their lives working on the mod, and you, as a player, literally can't go wrong with it. However, it doesn't necessarily attempt to recreate the visuals the way they were on GameCube. Original Resident Evil 4 uses a lot of fake, unrealistic effects and light placements to create very impressive imagery that to me personally is not as effective in the much more focused on realistic lighting HD project. I think it would be fair to say that if my only point of reference would have been the HD project itself, I'd literally see nothing wrong with it. But having played multiple versions, I prefer the interplay between light and shadows as it is presented on GameCube and Wii. Now, to summarize all this, if you want to play Resident Evil 4 at the time of writing this, and I have to specify since I'm sure as years pass we'll see even more ports of this game, hopefully not broken anymore, your best bet are the versions for GameCube, Wii, or PC, with the latter having RE4 tweaks and HD Project mod installed. With all that out of the way, let's actually get to the breakdown of Resident Evil 4, starting with a very important question. Is it a Resident Evil game in the first place? Brand identity is a complicated question, especially when a title wants to experiment and potentially get new audiences. Resident Evil 4 is undoubtedly not the same type of game as its predecessors. Beyond the combat and level design principles, the amount of inventory space you have in Resident Evil 4 might feel ludicrous in comparison. It's much easier to get ammo that you'll be using on metric tons of enemies, and let's not forget about quick-time events. I would even go as far as to say that calling Resident Evil 4 a survival horror game would be misrepresenting it. Rather, it's a survival thriller with horror aesthetics. So naturally, one can't help but wonder if with such drastic changes this is still a Resident Evil game. But what defines the brand in the first place? Is it the camera, the core mechanics, the style of location? I think the most productive discussion would come from looking at the pillars. Should we remember Resident Evil 1 and position it as a game that has defined the Resident Evil brand, it had 4 important pieces of foundation. First and foremost, resource management. You had to keep track of items in your inventory and make decisions whether you're ready to take something or not. This would feed into the other pillar, puzzles. To complete a goal, you had to do various actions with your items, including bringing them from one place to another, while limiting your offensive and defensive inventory capacity. Both of these aspects led to tension. You had to think whether you really want to spend bullets now, or maybe keep them for later and try to deal with the situation in a different way. Plus, there was the aspect of different scenarios happening in a room depending on various triggers, ranging from story progression to which side you entered it from, so with the exception of some specific locations, you could never know if a room is safe or not. And all that was rounded out by the pillar of knowledge. Information you would gather as you played would make you much more efficient in making the correct decisions. Especially useful with how Resident Evil pushes for multiple replays, where each time you're performing better and better. These aspects have defined how the first Resident Evil plays, and if we take a look at Resident Evil 4, we will find that it has exactly the same pillars. Approached from a different angle, yes, but still tackling the same high-level goals. Resource management is still important. While you can carry far more items, there is also a bigger amount of enemies in the game, so you have to think when and how to best use your inventory, as well how to spend money you receive throughout. Like with the original title, this leads into a puzzle aspect. Their goal in the first game was not the puzzles themselves per se, but how they influence your resource management. In Resident Evil 4, key items have their own slots, and there are few situations in the game that could be called classic puzzles, and those that could are pretty basic and serve more of a pace-breaking role. But the pillar still exists with the same goal of influence and resource management. First, your inventory is a minigame in itself, since you need to figure out how to most efficiently use the space, especially if you're really adamant about saving up something like 2 rocket launchers at once for when they will be needed later down the line. Then you need to decide when and which treasures you're willing to sell, since there are many sets that become more expensive once combined together. That's tapping into the same element of strategizing puzzles have in the first game, just applied to the new mechanical paradigms of Resident Evil 4. Both elements, like in the previous game, lead to tension. While Resident Evil 4 does revisit locations from time to time with new contexts, its world is far wider but more linear, so most places you will see only once. Still, the game regularly puts you in situations full of suspense. Despite your increased carrying capacity, very often the advantage is still not on your side. And like in the first game, knowledge plays a big role. You can spend time fighting a boss with all of its stages using only bullets. Or, if you figure out that they're weak to grenades, you can just throw a bunch you have at them for an easy kill. If you have them, which feeds all the way back into resource management. So on one hand, with its far bigger focus on action, Resident Evil 4 can't even be called to be of the same genre as Resident Evil 1. On another, it still has the same core pillars, albeit approached from its own perspective. Now, obviously the devil lies in the details, and I understand anyone who might not have been happy with the considerable mechanical shift Resident Evil 4 has introduced. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that since the core pillars remain the same, Resident Evil 4 still fits into the overall brand identity. With this question out of the way, let's discuss how the title actually handles its gameplay. The original Resident Evil games used fixed camera angles to limit your view, a very important aspect of creating tension. Resident Evil 4 has a dynamic camera now, but it still limits your view to one general direction by placing it over the shoulder. And you don't have full control of rotation, only 180 degrees at most. Although it should be worth noting that the default view is not constant, the game smartly repositions the camera in various contexts while still retaining the same limitations. Though this is a third-person game, there is no strafing. Resident Evil 4 still employs 10 controls, but they perfectly fit the setup. There are 2 distinct modes, movement and aiming, be it with a ranged weapon or a knife. This separation is why the original GameCube button layout is so ergonomic. Your left thumb is always on the stick, responsible for every kind of mode movement. There's also a single action button that does whatever is necessary: contextual world actions during movement, hitting when knife is out, and shooting in ranged aiming. You always know when to press what, and your fingers are always ready for that. Every weapon has a distinct feel to it thanks to all the variables involved. Recoil strength, reload time, sounds used, animation. There is a sense of weight to every weapon, even the small automatic ones. They're made even more distinct thanks to the upgrades. You will regularly encounter an enigmatic traveling merchant willing to provide those.
What are you buying?
Besides improving the core variables of damage, firing speed, reload speed, and capacity, each has an exclusive upgrade that either can change one of these values to something really high, or add a unique property like transforming mines into homing ones, or increasing the chance to get a critical hit on headshots. As a result, while everyone of course will have their preferences, there is no weapon that becomes truly useless, even your starting handgun. Though the weapon variety is high and a lot of their upgrades relate to speed, the gameplay is still not what one would call fast-paced. After all, you have to always be making a choice whether you should be moving or attacking. Can't do both at the same time. The enemies are designed with that in mind. They're not zombies. Nicknamed Ganados, they're mind-controlled people infected by a parasite, therefore much more nimble in movement. They can run, climb, dodge bullets, throw items, and so on. However, they won't overwhelm you like a swarm of flies. They might run, but they will actually slow down shortly before reaching you. They can be behind you, but they won't attack without making a creepy wail first.
Detrás de ti, imbécil!
The items they throw can be shot down while in their hands or mid-air, particularly effective if it's an explosive, and the game is fairly generous with a hitbox size that's much larger than the models themselves. So there is no need to be terribly precise in what's a relatively imprecise on purpose aiming system. And what I mean by that is whenever you line up a shot and see the dot from your targeting laser, it will always hit, but the actual act of lining it up can be tricky due to the speed of aiming and natural hand sway. That being said, as long as you hit the enemy somewhere, there is going to be an effect besides damage. Just simply getting hit will make them pause or even stumble back a bit, and Ganados all have hitboxes that can affect one another, meaning that just by pushing a single one backwards you can create a chain reaction of all others stumbling or otherwise getting temporarily stopped. This is already a very important factor for the purposes of crowd control, but enemies are even more reactive when you hit them in particular spots like the shoulders or legs. And that's why the knife is so easily accessible. More often than not, when a Ganado is lying down, it's best to quickly slash them to death rather than spend more bullets. Hitting the head or legs can put enemies into a stunned state during which they can be approached for front-facing or roundhouse kicks. Everyone else who gets in the way of your animation will also be smacked. And some types of opponents can be suplexed instead. Very effective. But all these effects are not exactly guaranteed. Your headshot can stun, or it can be a critical that makes an enemy's head explode, but it's not going to happen every time. This plays a big role in how you decide to spend your currently available resources, especially considering that the Plaga parasite has several evolutions, and some enemies will not die instantly. A set of hard-hitting tentacles will come out of their neck instead. And to keep tension high whether there will be this other form or not, even those that don't have it might walk several steps forward before actually dying. So while you have lots of weapons and there are tons of enemies, rarely you are on the offensive. Most of the conflict situations revolve around constantly repositioning for the purposes of crowd control and more effective use of your resources. And Resident Evil 4's almost perfect implementation of dynamic difficulty actually also plays a big role in that. Dynamic difficulty, which doesn't exist in professional mode where every variable is just maxed out, has two main purposes. First, to keep players in the state of flow. If you're performing very well, not taking damage, getting lots of good shots and so on, enemies will gradually become more aggressive, harder to hit due to their evasive maneuvers, and have more health. The opposite will happen when you receive damage and miss your shots. As a result, the level of challenge always feels appropriate. This mechanic is so seamless that people will barely ever notice it if not for one particular aspect, which I think goes a bit too far. In some locations there are enemies which are removed or added depending on the hidden difficulty rank. I do think it's fine to remove a couple enemies here and there, but it should be done only to those that come in as reinforcements or otherwise are not seen when you enter an area. But there are cases where Resident Evil 4 does precisely the opposite. Like in the very well-known to players water room, there are two crossbow cultists on a couple balconies that might get removed when you die. Such cases are really noticeable and can break the illusion a bit, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it negatively affects enjoyment or anything. Particularly because even when there's less enemies in some rooms, there's still quite a lot of them. And that's the second purpose behind dynamic difficulty, to tap into resource management and make sure you waste more bullets. Inefficient spending already happens naturally when you don't have enough experience or are somewhat stressed out. That's enough to cause your death, so there's no need to punish you even more. You already feel tense and it's fine that Ganados take less hits to go down. But when you do play well, you're most likely stockpiling ammo, and the game obviously doesn't want you to have too much of it. So by increasing health, aggressiveness and evasiveness of enemies, you naturally have to spend more. And when you do, you might actually at some point enter that not so efficient, wasteful, stressed out state, which will make Resident Evil 4 back down a bit to not overwhelm with pressure. This is an incredibly elegant interplay between systems and player psychology, and probably the most important reason why Resident Evil 4 always feels engaging. You never get too bored from power, but also, when on the other side of the spectrum, don't get overwhelmed or ragey to the point that you don't know if you want to keep going. And even if, with all these systems in place, you still manage to accumulate tons of resources, Resident Evil 4 from time to time has special encounters specifically designed to run you dry. But that's probably better to discuss in the context of the game's level design at large. In Resident Evil 4, you play as Leon S. Kennedy, one of the protagonists from the second game, now working as a US government special agent who was sent to a place only known as rural Europe, which clearly was meant to be Spain, probably to the dismay of anyone who speaks Spanish, to find the president's kidnapped daughter. There, the villagers you encounter become extremely hostile, and after reaching its center, you are forced to fight for survival against an overwhelming number of foes. Mind you, this is practically the beginning of the game. By this point, you'd barely have anything outside of a pistol and some ammo for it. And the village center is an extremely large arena with a lot of pathways, which means not only places where you can run, but also those where the Canadas can come from. Trying to escape will just cause more villagers to spawn, and in one specific direction there is a chainsaw man, a special infected type which will kill you in one hit regardless of your health. It will drop a ruby treasure you can sell to the merchant though. It won't try to attack you unless you come close, unlike another chainsaw man who will spawn should you decide to find safety in the big house in the center. Which you might not, this is totally optional. If you do enter, there is a special cutscene of Leon barricading the door. Ganados are trying to break through the windows, which you can barricade as well. Upstairs you can find a shotgun, very useful against groups of enemies. However, don't think that you're safe here, since these Ganados are not zombies in shambles. They will break windows and place ladders to climb the second floor directly. Of course, you can keep pushing down the one that leads into the room, but this won't help against the enemies climbing the roof on the side. Near the church there is a tower, you can climb it. However, don't think that you can stay for a prolonged time there. The enemies will start throwing Molotov cocktails. What, did you see a cowshed? It has two entrances. There's practically no place here where you can take a solid defensive position with nothing coming from behind or the sides. And those little pathways near the gates that can provide such protection are undesirable due to a lack of space to maneuver. You have to keep moving, while the infected will try to flank you from different sides, throw objects from rooftops. At some point more reinforcements will come. You have to preserve ammo, therefore engage in close quarters whenever possible, and hope that the enemies will drop some bullets for your weapons, or healing herbs. When you kill enough villagers, a church bell will ring, and everyone, like cattle, will just be drawn towards it. Suddenly, you're all alone in the village center, finally having some rest from this absolutely intense sequence with no place where you could hide or feel safe. What an amazing, intense opener to the game, setting up the mood and pillars perfectly. Here's the really interesting part. Throughout the rest of the game, there's never going to be an encounter like this. This is the only combat arena so large and with so many interconnected pathways and triggers in various locations. And Resident Evil 4 is content with doing an encounter like this only once. Mind you, this is not a criticism, but rather a way to point out that Resident Evil 4 is an action-focused game that takes on average 15 hours to complete your first time, and it aims to never repeat any single gameplay scenario. And not only it aims to do that, it succeeds. The only activity you'll be doing twice is a QTE of running away from a boulder. And speaking of QTEs, while there is a fair amount of them, they never feel overbearing. You won't encounter them that often, the buttons are randomized but always within the limited amount of possible sets, so it's less of a mechanic that somehow tries to check your attention and more of a way to change your emotional state by having you frantically press buttons as fast as possible. Unless it's somehow related to a sequence where you need to be very concentrated. So like puzzles, QTEs don't exist in this game to specifically test your abilities, but rather to change up the pace from time to time, and that's why they work. Now, obviously, Resident Evil 4 doesn't create new mechanics or enemies for absolutely every encounter, although you can be sure that boss battles will have something of the sort. The lake monster is the only time you will ever throw harpoons, and the Verdugo fight arena is the only place with freezing nitrogen. When it comes to all other non-boss encounters throughout the rest of the game, Resident Evil 4 absolutely, masterfully combines all elements at its disposal in different combinations and compositions, so you would never have any similar to one you already had before. And that's why it feels confident enough to put the village center encounter at the beginning and then never do something like it again. Oh, don't get me wrong, there will be massive encounters in the future, just nothing like this one. I've already mentioned the waterhole, you will have to fight lots of cultists there. But unlike the village, it's just one big open location with no houses, no special points you could take advantage of for a while. In fact, what you need to do with Ashley is reach a room on the other side where you will be safe only but for a little time, enough to press the buttons activating a crank back in the main part of the hall. Then you have to go back and one of you has to turn the crank to lower the bridge. Leon can do it faster, but Ashley can't shoot, so you have to choose, and we'll discuss the whole deal with Ashley a bit later. After that you get to another floor and you have to help Ashley get up on some raised platforms so she would operate the two cranks there, which would open up a pathway to escape the hall. You have to protect Ashley from below, but the cultists target both of you, which means constant dividing of attention. Eventually you make your way out. So this is also a very long and intense scenario that will keep you on your toes, but in terms of its style and goals, it's nothing like the village center. And in Act 3 on the island, there will be a full-on assault where you're assisted by a freaking helicopter against the military infected. It's pretty much the only set piece where you go on a full-on offensive like that, full of explosions, going against Gatling guns, and all kinds of Ganados just dying left and right like flies. There was nothing like this in Resident Evil 4 before, nor there will be after. This uniqueness applies not only to larger set pieces like the ones I have mentioned. Absolutely everything is a never before and never after seen scenario where the combination of level design and enemy composition creates something truly new. Rule of threes? What's that? Resident Evil 4 employs the rule of one. There's only one maze garden full of plague-infested wolves which you have to traverse while constantly keeping track of any possible ambushes. There's only one scenario where you find a wagon that can be set on fire and pushed onto a huge group of Ganados. There's only one Donkey Kong staircase with someone regularly launching barrels at you, something that you can later on turn against the cultists. And as much as that's a pity, there's only one instance where a dog that you can save, and by the way, if you haven't, you're a monster, will arrive to help you.
Hey, it's that dog.
That's one of the reasons why I don't understand why the island is disliked so much. It is true that arenas there are somewhat less polished than in the castle and the village. For example, in some encounters it is pretty straightforward to find a dominating defensive position. But it's also full of absolutely new and exciting or tense sequences that still keep the game fresh, like the arena where you have to go through a bunch of infinitely respawning enemies so you could activate several consoles, or riding a bulldozer controlled by Ashley as she just rams the complex down. And it's not like Act 3 forgets about the horror atmosphere and aesthetics. The overall approach towards level design also means that enemy types that are supposed to be unique and memorable will stay that way due to not being used that often. There is a very scary regenerator infected type which, naturally, regenerates any of its blown off body parts. Technically you can kill them even then, but really there's no way for you to know how, so you just have to avoid them. That is, until you get the infrared scope, which will showcase all their weak spots. After that, they're dangerous, but not as menacing, so the game will quickly stop using them in favor of the upgraded and even creepier Iron Maiden type. Now those tend to have weak spots on their back as well, which means you have to be a little creative in how you reach those. But even that has its limits, and there's only so much the game can do with these Iron Maidens, so when Resident Evil 4 runs out of situations where they could be interesting, that's it, it discards them completely. There's only 3 locations where you will encounter the bug like Novistadores, and absolutely every time it will happen in a different context. Not just the environments vary, but their strategies too, from being very stealthy in the sewers to just swarming all over in the caves. Now, while I do use mostly combat-specific scenarios as examples now, it should be noted that if Resident Evil 4 would just be a fight after fight after fight, it wouldn't have the wonderful pacing that it does now. The game knows where to put segments with absolutely no combat at all, just walking and a bit of exploration. The game knows where to spruce up the pacing with little puzzles that are never so mind-bending that you get stuck upon them for long. And both are used for the goals of resting from combat, finally feeling safe for a while, and raising suspense as you get the feeling that any moment all hell might just break loose. If I do have a criticism about how Resident Evil 4 is paced, is that some of its permanent checkpoints feel spread out too far from one another. There is no increments in this game, you can save as much as you want at typewriters that are usually placed at pretty consistent intervals. And between the permanent save points, Resident Evil 4 is pretty generous with checkpoints, so you don't just lose all your progress on death. In that context, it's a bit weird that sometimes it takes quite a lot of time to finally get to a typewriter, an aspect that can be annoying if you're getting to a point where you need to end your game session, but not a big deal. The rule of one applies to another recurring gameplay element related to the central narrative conceit. You were sent to save the president's daughter, and therefore she will accompany you for a significant part of the experience. You know, before playing Resident Evil 4, I heard a lot about Ashley. That she transforms the game into a long and bothersome escort mission, that she's annoying, that she constantly calls for help. But after playing the game, I can tell you with an absolutely straight face. If somebody has that opinion, they have to simply replay the game and try to spend a bit more time strategizing and not leave Ashley alone in random places. Because, let me tell you something, Ashley is amazing as a character you have to escort. First, she always stays as close behind your back as possible. When you have to aim, she gets even closer to make sure she doesn't get in your way. If it so happens in the chaos of action that she does get separated and will be in the direction of your aiming, she will duck to not pose a problem. So honestly, even though there's a command to leave Ashley waiting somewhere, as well as very exceptionally few hiding spots the enemies can find her in, there is barely any reason to keep her separate from the action. She adapts to your strategies very easily. And if someone snatches her, again either in the chaos of action or because you're in a segment where the two of you are forced to be in separate locations, she gives an absolutely unmissable audio cue.
Help! Leon! Help!
And look, this will sound harsh, but if you hear "Leon, help!" so often to the point that it annoys you enough that it becomes an extremely widespread contentious point found all over the internet for many years, I really don't have it in my style to insult anybody's skills, because we're all different people and are good at different things, and just because I'm a game designer doesn't mean I'm a pro player, but it's not an Ashley problem, that's all I'm saying. Besides, even calling Resident Evil 4 a long escort mission is a misrepresentation of the game. Ashley will accompany you directly in at most 1/3 of its runtime. Once again following the rule of one, where absolutely every situation involving her is going to be different. There is even a segment where you play as her, which in the Japanese version actually imitates classic fixed Resident Evil camera, and honestly I wish it would stay that way for the international release as well. It's a very smart holistic decision connecting the game with its past. But even without that, playing as Ashley for a bit varies up the pace very nicely. So really, mechanically, there's absolutely no reason to hate Ashley. Throughout the game, from time to time you find yellow herbs, and those increase a character's maximum health. You can increase yours or Ashley's. You really won't get any significant disadvantage if you don't give any to Ashley. That's how a well-implemented companion she is, never getting in your way and adding a little bit of extra tension every now and then where necessary. The only prism through which I can sort of understand the opinion that Ashley is annoying is that of the narrative.
You alright?
I'm fine! Leave me alone!
Ashley, wait! Ashley!
What's going on?
But really that's only relevant if you don't accept one very important thing. That Resident Evil 4 is campy as fuck, and for better or worse, wholeheartedly embraces it. Resident Evil 4 is really good at setting things up. I suppose it has to be, given that it's clearly designed as a potential entry point for new audiences, happening 6 years after the previous games and fully ignoring the "let's take the fight to Umbrella" sequel hooks, instead closing off the company between games. Therefore, there is only a few returning characters: Leon himself, his relationship status, his complicated friend/adversary Ada Wong, and Wesker. Even Krauser, who has a past with Leon in the context of this story, is a new character. The whole premise with the kidnapping of the president's daughter, the resurfacing after many centuries cult that's hell-bent on world domination through spreading the mind-controlling Las Plagas parasite and using the infected Ashley to progress that goal and start with capturing the United States. All the while there's another party for which Ada works that wants the parasite specimen for their own purpose. The through line is so straightforward that it can be clearly explained in a little paragraph, and there's nothing wrong with that. Your goal is always clear, and it's easy to track the motivation of others. But what Resident Evil 4 is not particularly great at is fleshing out everything it has set up. For example, there are 3 antagonists in the game: the Los Illuminados cult leader Sadler, his loyal nobleman follower Salazar, and the village chief and priest Mendes. They are all fascinating characters, but really don't have enough meaningful presence in the game, and their history and motivations are fleshed out a little bit only in the optional files you can find, not really the story proper. And as a result, some characters feel wasted. Mendes might be a very menacing figure, but after seeing him only several times, you'll dispose of the boss and that's it. Characters like Salazar have more presence due to hacking your communicator, but then you have to face a particular aspect of the game. It's writing. And it is... well, it's bad. But it's not just bad. It's actually so bad that it's endearing. Montage time!
I've been expecting you, my brethren.
No thanks, bro.
Since you're here, why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
Oh.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
Oh, what a touching moment we have here.
All spoiled thanks to your interruption. Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?
You're nothing but an extra in my script, so don't get too carried away. Your biggest scene is over.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.
Well then, why don't you show me what a first-class script is like, through your own actions?
Okay, let me guess. She's the president's daughter?
That's too good for a guess. Want to start explaining?
Psychic powers. Nah, just kidding with you, amigo. I overheard one of the villagers talking something about the president's daughter in the church.
And who might you be?
Me llamo Luis Serra. I used to be a cop in Madrid. But now I'm just a good-for-nothing guy who happens to be quite a ladies' man.
Why'd you quit?
Phew, policia. You put your life on the line, nobody really appreciates you enough for it. Being a hero isn't what it's cracked up to be anymore.
Used to be a cop myself. Only for a day, though.
I thought I was bad.
It's an absolute cringe, but also you can't help but smile and just enjoy it, especially considering that the acting is actually really, really good. This might sound like a backhanded compliment, but there is just something about hearing stupid shit being said with such extreme confidence that you can't just stay mad.
Looks like this is it.
It stinks.
Sure does.
No way, Leon.
Way.
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
And hey, Resident Evil 4 is a game where Leon categorically refuses to use ladders to climb down even from extreme heights and suplexes cultists. So it's actually very easy to forgive moments like this.
Leon,
Louis.
I've got something for you guys. What? Oh, shit! I must have dropped it when I was running away from them.
Dropped what?
A drug that'll stop your convulsions. I have to go back and get it.
Let me come with you.
No, you stay here with Leon. He is better with the ladies, I'm sure.
Because of moments like this.
Leon! Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude!
By the way, this is Louis, a character you will meet only a couple times before his death. Spoiler warnings, I guess? Don't worry, there's really nothing that will actually make you care about Louis, except the fact that he had some endearingly stupid lines, and it is actually sad to realize that you're not gonna hear more. And look, it doesn't really matter whether that's intended or not, as I have seen a lot of arguments online regarding whether Resident Evil 4 was actually supposed to take itself seriously, but let's face it, a game with a random laser avoidance scene like this is so exaggerated that any sort of hamminess doesn't feel out of place. But it does conflict somewhat with the world building that clearly tries to take itself seriously. What happened with the village and its occupants is a tragedy. In fact, in the credits, the game actually shows the life before everything went to shit, and it's a surprisingly poignant piece of visual storytelling. And then you have this admittedly genius piece of dark humor from Leon. So on one hand, you have very immersive environmental subtle storytelling and world building through stuff like rock reliefs, and on another you have whatever that is.
Apparently, there's a religious cult group involved. They're called the Los Illuminados.
Los Illuminados. That's a mouthful. Anyway, I had an unexpected run-in with the big cheese of this village.
But you're okay, right?
Yeah, but he could have killed me, but he let me live.
Plus, the actual level design also brings inconsistency to the otherwise intricate world building. From a gameplay perspective, the emotional reaction to entering the lava room in the castle is amazing, and that is a fun encounter that I enjoyed. But come on, lava room in a castle? How does that work? Or why do you have to go through a whole minecart sequence to get to a key that opens up a door to a cathedral tower? That just doesn't make sense. But at the same time, Resident Evil 4 is not a game where you should really think about those kinds of things. You just have to embrace them on an emotional level. Like the merchant. Who is this person? He's clearly infected, but he doesn't attack Leon. How does he manage to get around everywhere? Why does he have a shooting gallery challenges that reward you with bottle caps? All these questions, and the answer to them is just accept the presence of this extremely useful character selling new weapons and upgrades, who has an insanely memorable scene-chewing voice and lines.
Got some rare things on sale, stranger.
Don't question any of this. Just embrace it and enjoy, even when analytically speaking you can clearly point out inconsistencies with another really prominent part of what makes Resident Evil 4 amazing. Its visual, sound, and music design. Resident Evil 4 is a beautiful game. And the reason behind it is not simply the fidelity and quality of the models and environments, although of course that plays a role too, but Resident Evil 4 is absolutely masterful at creating amazing compositions. I've already shown in the beginning one of my most favorite moments in the entire game, the run towards the castle. The stonework in the distance, the tree silhouette standing against the dark sky, while illuminated in an exaggerated fashion by a flashlight, Leon and Ashley stand out in their loneliness in this wide, hostile space. Everything is designed in such a way so it would be framed in a particularly atmospheric fashion when being put in the viewport of the limited front-facing camera you have. From seemingly ordinary but extremely beautiful castle halls, to creepy caves, to abandoned science facilities, there is always something that made me personally stop every now and then and go, damn, is the composition here so good. The light, the shadows, the contrast, how it all leads your view and makes even the most mundane of locations feel atmospheric and meaningful, with a purpose. You could spend all day long just looking at various shots and marveling at them. And mind you, all these examples are taken from gameplay directly, and it's really difficult to achieve stuff like this in an environment where the player has control, although once again the limitations Resident Evil 4 imposes on that certainly help. So naturally, should we look at the actual cinematics, they're also full of very impressively structured visuals. Sound design plays a big part in creating the atmosphere of the game, especially considering that most of the time you don't hear any ambient music at all, just the environments, you, and your footsteps. Which makes it exceptionally easy to hear enemies when they're nearby. And when you do engage them, the music that sounds is not melodic in any way. It's grating, hostile, full of harsh sounds and transitions. And it's great that it's like that, since it creates a feeling of undesirability, particularly fitting for when you encounter some of the more creepy enemies. There's only two cases when the music tries to be actively aesthetically pleasing. The first one is whenever you reach a spot where you won't be attacked by enemies. Although I guess it's arguable whether it's pleasing, since it still has this feeling of being somewhat unsettling, but it's also calming in a somber and somewhat sorrowful way. The properly aesthetically soothing piece is whenever you save the game, which emotionally makes reaching a save point being the most desirable action. And then, the other case of aesthetically pleasing music starts appearing close to the end of the game with more epic sounding pieces, which is fully in line with how both you and Leon basically switch fully to the offensive. And of course, course, would this be a real Resident Evil game if it didn't end with going towards the horizon? But finishing the main campaign isn't the end of the Resident Evil 4 experience, since after there's all the extras that you unlock. First things first, after you beat the game once, you can start a new round with all your weapons and upgrades carried over, as well as new items being available for purchase. The full list depends on what other extras you have completed, although it should be noted that while Resident Evil 4 shows your stats at the end of a run, it doesn't rank you. So the game doesn't really push you to replay the campaign like previous titles from the franchise would, but there is still a reason to. I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to go through all locations mowing down through enemies with a Chicago typewriter while wearing a mafia suit? Especially when with its infinite bullets, instead of reloading, you can do this. Awesome. To unlock this and more though, you have to go through the bonus content. There is Assignment Ada, a small approximately half-hour non-canon scenario where you play as well Ada, collecting Plaga samples around the island. It's fine, I guess. There is a separate Ways campaign that was originally created for the PlayStation 2 version, and that's why all its cutscenes are pre-rendered. It's sort of a semi-canon-ish with some plot hole small campaign where we also play Zeta and see what she has been doing in parallel to Leon. This one I didn't like. The concept is interesting and there are some new weapons and tools like the grapple which allows you to reach places Leon couldn't, and even one entirely new area, but it feels like a bunch of random, very similar to one another encounters, not as intricately designed as the ones for the main game. But also I can't really fault it for that, because there's only so much one can do when taking locations specifically designed for a different purpose and changing them up. So, as an optional extra, it's absolutely fine, and you do need to finish the mini-campaign to get the aforementioned Mafia suit and Chicago typewriter, so at least the rewards are very nice. The best and most replayable extra in Resident Evil 4 is definitely its implementation of the Mercenaries mode. It's a high-score arcade game with an unlimited number of enemies and a limited amount of time which you can extend. However, there is a risk and reward aspect to it, as the score will save only if you get successfully extracted when the timer reaches 0. It's very fun because it combines the overall strategic shooting mechanics with a very fast-paced style of gameplay, and it doesn't feel out of place because the enemies are still the same. As you get higher ratings, you unlock more characters, each with their own unique loadout and special abilities that absolutely changes the style of play, even including powerful mutations that can kill tons of enemies in one good hit. If you just care about the hand cannon unlock for the campaign, then it's probably extra several hours of content, but the mode is really endlessly replayable, and for me personally the runs never got old, and it's just pretty cool to get back to it every now and then. I suppose it would be fitting to end the main analytical part of the video on this note and get to scoring Resident Evil 4 with my Stasocritic rating system. Stasocritic is my personal scoring system that's divided into 5 categories of various weights. Each has 11 scores from 0 to 10 with specific criteria. The first category is designed with a weight of 4, since the way a game is played and structured is what defines the experience the most. And here, I will definitely assign a 10. Look, is the game perfect? No. There are some small issues there and there, including some disappointing bonus content. But that's it, and honestly that's not enough to bring it down to a 9. The core gameplay and original control scheme live in perfect harmony, alongside the enemy design that greatly takes advantage of the mechanics, and of course we have the level progression where 99% of challenges are unique combinations of various elements that you will see only once and then get to enjoy something new again. So some arenas on the island have spots where you can hold out for a dominant strategy. Big whoop! In the context of the absolutely insane amount of perfectly paced variety Resident Evil 4 provides, that's nothing. Which leads us to emotions, an important category with a weight of 3, since our personal enjoyment also matters a lot. You can hate absolutely polished games and love to death flawed ones. It's all about them feelings. And I'm going to assign a 10. Look, Resident Evil 4 is not a game that has impressed me with its narrative, for example. I really don't care about half of the already small character cast. I sure had a laugh, but I'm conflicted about the dissonance between the tone of writing and tone of world building, and even the latter aspect has dissonance within it, so a significant part of the game is something that I am not a particular fan of. However, even after a prolonged period of time passes since playing Resident Evil 4, show me a gameplay screenshot of any of its locations, and I will instantly have a memory resurface of the tense and suspenseful scenario that I had to overcome there. It's very rare when a game is so thoroughly enjoyable that pretty much every encounter from the longer than a dozen hours campaign just gets rooted somewhere in your memory, so there is definitely no other score that I could assign here. Now we get to discuss cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and is about how well the game connects all of its aspects together into a singular, wholesome experience. Regrettably, this is where I will have to assign an 8. Resident Evil 4 has a perfect blend of environment design, sounds, music, gameplay mechanics, enemy actions and compositions working together to create a wide array of feelings throughout the campaign. And it weaves a very flowy interplay between feeling powerful and powerless, gameplay that often keeps you on your toes and is as tense as it is memorable. And then there's the writing. Not even the story, because that could still work, and some of the world-building aspects that are so tonally dissonant that you just have to accept them for what they are and don't think about that. And honestly, whenever there's very significant elements that you sort of have to ignore thinking too deep about to enjoy, is it really a sign of cohesion? If the whole game would have been like that, sure, but in the current scenario, I don't think so. But also I can't ignore how intricately Resident Evil 4 works with tons of other elements in place. Which leads us to context. Character arcs, writing, plot, basically everything that provides context to the player. Given everything I have said about this, the score might surprise you, but it's a 7 from me. Look, I think the only unquestionably solid part of Resident Evil 4's context is actually the premise setup. Again, even world building jumps between being very serious and very ridiculous. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy every single second of it all. I suppose this is actually thanks to the voice acting more so than anything. So many lines are honest to God stupid, but they're delivered with such a degree of confidence that one can't help but go, well, that is badass, actually. Way.
No way, Leon.
Way.
Which probably means it would make sense to discuss aesthetics now, respectively all about line delivery, visual design, sound effects, music, and given everything that I have said in the video so far, I don't think it makes any sense to go less than a 10. I mean, okay, to be fair, it would if we'd discuss the modern remastered releases, but let's not fault the actual game for it, shall we? So with all these scores and their weights taken together, we can calculate the final Stasocritic rating of Resident Evil 4, and it's a 94. It's an absolutely fantastic title. As long as we're talking about the original several releases or the PC version with the RE4 tweaks and HD Project mod. The other ports are a bit less fantastic, especially when you encounter broken AI. But look, in my system it's actually very difficult to get a rating higher than 90 with how the score criteria are defined, and the fact that Resident Evil 4 has done it is a testament to its quality and why I would still recommend it even if you haven't played any Resident Evil games before. And even if you're not a survival horror fan, because once again, this is more of a survival thriller than anything. A real classic. The reason why I am so critical of modern releases of Resident Evil 4 is that they give the wrong impression about the game. I actually haven't played it in the past, and I'm glad that even though I was already owning the game on PS4, I still decided to try the original GameCube version first. I'm not sure what kind of experience I would have had if I would just play the PS4 port. I mean, probably still positive, but definitely not as positive. Maybe I'd be of a similar opinion that many people seem to have now, that while Resident Evil 4 is an important piece of video game history, it is outdated. But it's not outdated. Truly great design is timeless. and while there are decisions that might not feel conventional in our modern times, the design of Resident Evil 4 is truly great. I just wish the remastered releases would understand that. Still, if you're familiar with the series, you probably know it has tried to recreate the high that Resident Evil 4 has reached for many to, well, let's say varying degrees of success among the public. I think the lesson that can be learned from Resident Evil 4 is that it's very easy to misunderstand why something works and clicks with a large number of people. Is action more mainstream than horror? Absolutely. But Resident Evil 4 is not just an action game. It uses its horror aesthetics to create purpose, strategy, tension, and all that in turn forms moments that stay in your memory forever. And that's why, if you're like past me who hasn't played Resident Evil 4 for many years, then know this. It's actually never late to play Resident Evil 4. Thank you all for watching, I hope you have enjoyed the video, and don't forget to leave a comment. Now, let's all sing Kumbaya!
We could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire.
Con alegría.